Greek letter Pi Marx. This page intentionally left blank for Transposition and Critique 4.1 Transposition. Marx left a massive amount of work, but fragmentary as it is impossible to induce Marx's philosophy or political economy or communism out of the corpus. It was Engels who, after Marx's death, first sought to make it into a system. He constructed an edifice of Marxism in conformity with the Hegelian system: dialectic materialism, natural dialectics, historical materialism, political economy and state theory, and so on. Since then, Marxism has striven to perfect this system, including theories of literature and art. Yet these projects have become increasingly far-fetched. It appears to me that Marx never intended to systematize his thought, not because he could not, but because he chose not to. To understand Marx's intervention, one has to bracket the conventional categories of political economy, philosophy, and political philosophy. It is necessary to observe Marx's footwork, regardless of the targeted object, and in so doing, there is one clear thing that stands out. Marx's thought existed as nothing other than a critique of previous thought. Capital. The book, written systematically, though left incomplete, is subtitled Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, a book of critique. But this critique is far from a condemnation. Marx never intended to construct a certain positive doctrine upon the denial of his predecessors, that is, Ricardo or Hegel or anyone else. Neither was he an epigone of any of them. It is crucial to read Marx's corpus as critique. I believe that his critique will never lose its significance, even as the historical contexts in which it appeared become obsolete. Thus my objective is to recover the function and significance of his critique and recognize what kind of epistemological light it sheds on the coming ages. Marx once told his daughters to doubt everything on principle, but this doubt of everything should be distinguished from unprincipled skepticism. To Marx, doubting was not separate from living. What kind of life was it? Marx persisted in doubting the subject qua the substantial center, and saw it as a product of relational structure. Where, then, does the doubting subject exist? This is the question that was omitted by the major trend of thought that fabricated the false dichotomy of Marxism and existentialism, and so on. This line of thought ignored the very existence of Marx. In the first place, I disagree with the common framework that opposes Marx to Descartes and/or Kant. As I have mentioned, cogito, the doubting subject, appears in between systems, in between communities, and this interstice is a space of sheer difference. Finally, it is insubstantial and amorphous. It cannot be spoken of positively. No sooner than it is, its function is lost. It is a transcendental topos, a space for transcritique. Yet at the same time, to approach this space, one must begin with a reference to concrete space, and for that one can turn to some cities where radical intercourse occurred, like Amsterdam, Königsberg, and London. Descartes wrote about Amsterdam, where he lived in exile, as a place where in the crowd of a great, active people, and of one more concerned with its own affairs than curious about those of others, I have been able, without lacking any of the conveniences that there are in the most frequented towns, to live as solitarily and retired as in the most remote deserts. One Cartesian cogito, the subject of radical skepticism, cannot be grasped if separated from this kind of space. Later in his life, Descartes lost the critical aspect of cogito and his thinking resulted in the thinking subject, parallel, it seems, to his return to Paris, where he became an authoritarian figure, the founder of Cartesianism. Kant, for his part, rarely left Königsberg during his lifetime. Among philosophers, Kant was perhaps the least inclined to travel, but Königsberg, though geographically remote, was not in the least a rustic, provincial town. It was one of the commercial centers of the Baltic Sea, then the site of the most active northern European trade. It was a city where various kinds of information intersected. Kant wrote about it, a city like Königsberg on the river Pregel, the capital of a state, where the representative National Assembly of the government resides, a city with a university, a city also favored by its location for maritime commerce, and which, by way of rivers, has the advantages of commerce both with the interior of the country as well as with neighboring countries of different languages and customs, can well be taken as an appropriate place for enlarging one's knowledge of people as well as of the world at large, where such knowledge can be acquired even without travel. Because of the sea traffic, it was in a sense closer to London, the capital of the British Empire, than Berlin was. Königsberg, having once belonged to East Prussia, was later occupied by Russia and has been a part of it ever since. Kant's cosmopolitanism is inseparable from the atmosphere of the city, which, one can say, he he chose. Like Hegel and Fichte, Kant was invited to teach at the State Academy in Berlin. Unlike the others, he rejected the invitation. Had he accepted, he would have been compelled to think from the standpoint of the state. Hence, Kant's refusal was in a sense a transposition, and an exile lacking physical movement. And Marx, when considering him, too, one is drawn into thinking about transposition and its significance in the formation of thought. But one cannot simple-mindedly emphasize Marx the refugee, for the fact is that Marx was deported and exiled to Britain, but he was later pardoned and returned home for a brief period in the 1850s. He then chose to return to England and London, because this nation, the most advanced in capitalist development, and its capital were ideal for his analysis of capitalism. Therefore, he cannot plainly be considered a political refugee. He chose to live in London. The point to be stressed is that Marx also thought in the interstice, the transcritical space, where one has to confront different languages, thoughts, and value systems, and from which it is impossible to induce a certain positive doctrine. When he was in exile in Paris in 1843, Marx wrote economic and philosophical manuscripts. Those reflections, often identified as early Marx, epitomize an application of the Feuerbachian theory of self-alienation to the political economy, an approach similar to the one Moses Hess had already rendered. In this sense, it is possible to say that Marx at that time was still within the problematic consciousness of the young Hegelians. Soon after, he wrote Holy Family, and 2 years later, in 1845, he was expelled from France and moved to Brussels. There he wrote theses on Feuerbach and, in collaboration with Engels, the German ideology. Louis Althusser famously considered Marx's turn in this period crucial, calling it an epistemological breakthrough and implying that Marx not only overturned Hegel's philosophy materialistically, but also realized a discontinuous transformation of, or development from, the Hegelian framework itself. This is certainly a radical turn. Meanwhile, my transcritical position observes that it is not the only radical turn that occurred in Marx. In reference to Kant's Copernican turn, I remarked earlier that it is commonly understood as a remarkable revolution from geocentrism to heliocentrism, but that such an idea had existed since long before Copernicus. It was finally constituted as a theory by Copernicus, only thanks to his shift from the position that the subject passively perceives the objective world to the position that objects are composed by the form of the active subject. It was the latter that Kant appeared to consider important. But when, in consequence, post-Kantian idealism was established around this position and flourished, another, more ultimate destination of the Kantian turn, that one is thrown into the world, instead of the world being of one's own composition, was forgotten. At that point Kant quickly intervened to refute those idealists who had grown under his influence. In the history of science, the event of the Copernican turn happened only once, but in Kant, the Copernican turn occurred more than once. For the Kantian critique involved incessant transposition and was not rooted in a static positionality. I call this Transcritique. It is also possible to propose a Marxian turn as such. The early Marx, who was one of the young Hegelians, was faithful to Feuerbach's materialist overturning of Hegelian idealism. Feuerbach's critique of religion argued that God is a self-alienation of the generic essence of humans, and that individuals as sensuous beings should recover their generic essence. The early Marx basically relied upon this critique, except that he transposed and extended the account of self-alienation to the domains of the monetary economy and the state. In this context, Marx observed, the basis of irreligious criticism is, man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has already lost himself again. But man is no abstract being encamped outside the world. Man is the world of man, the state, society. This state, this society, produce religion, an inverted world consciousness, because they are an inverted world. 5. What is noteworthy here is that Marx goes on to liken this overturn to the Copernican turn. The criticism of religion disillusions man to make him think and act and shape his reality like a man who has been disillusioned and has come to reason, so that he will revolve round himself and therefore round his true sun. Religion is only the illusory sun which revolves round man as long as he does not revolve around himself. The task of history, therefore, once the world beyond the truth has disappeared, is to establish the truth of this world. The immediate task of philosophy, which is at the service of history, once the holy form of human self-estrangement has been unmasked, is to unmask human self-estrangement in its unholy forms. Thus the criticism of heaven turns into the criticism of the earth. the criticism of religion into the criticism of law and the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics. This materialist overturn may appear to be decisive, but it is still incomplete. The true Copernican turn of Marx later expressed itself when he criticized this materialism and affirmed an active moment. Conversely, in the idealism, the chief defect of all previous materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the object, reality, and sensuousness are conceived only in the form of the object, or of contemplation, but not as human sensuous activity, practice, and not subjectively. Hence it happened that the active side, in contradiction to materialism, was set forth by idealism, but only, Marx abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real, sensuous activity as such. 7. Marx's Copernican turn, 2, occurred more than once, and the discursive transpositions were always accompanied by travel between real existing places. The German ideology was written from such an interstice. If we wish to rate at its true value this philosophic charlatanry, which awakens even in the breast of the righteous German citizen a glow of patriotic feeling, if we wish to bring out clearly the pettiness, the parochial narrowness of this whole young Hegelian movement, and in particular the tragicomic contrast between the illusions of these heroes about their achievements and the actual achievements themselves, we must look at the whole spectacle from a standpoint beyond the frontiers of Germany. The standpoint that locates itself as beyond the frontiers of Germany is not simply a real place like France or England. This is the difference, as it were, between German discourse and French-English discourse. As a point of fact, Marx's attempt, in collaboration with Arnold Ruge, to establish the German-French annual journal, namely, to combine German philosophy and French political movements editorially, was contemptuously ignored by French activists. There was no possible way for the French socialists, who had matured through real political experiences, to accept a theory deduced merely from philosophy. It was not national antagonism that prevented the easy acceptance of such a project but actual experience. Young Marx, who had abundant self-confidence, had to learn the hard lesson that German philosophy turned to be irrelevant or odd beyond the frontiers of Germany, and that there was a reality developing far away from the theory. In contrast, for Engels there was no such repercussion from beyond the German frontiers, for he had long been exposed to the realities of capitalism in Britain, and in confronting classical economics, in many ways, he was much more mature than Marx. On the occasion of publishing part of the German ideology in 1888, years after it was written, Engels stressed that historical materialism was first formulated in that book, and by Marx. Concerning this, in the early 1960s, the Japanese philosopher Wataru Hiramatsu presented evidence that challenged that assertion. Hiramatsu conducted an elaborate text critique of the German ideology, and showed that the text on Feuerbach was mostly written by Engels. Marx's participation was limited to some crucial revisions here and there, and furthermore, comparing the earlier writings of both, he proved that Engels had conceptualized historical materialism first. What Hiramatsu wanted to say was that Engels was, at that point, theoretically more advanced than Marx, who was still in the paradigm of the young Hegelians. Why, then, didn't Engels simply spell out his advanced position? I believe it was not because of any humility, but rather because it was his intention to construct Marxism after Marx's death. Marx himself did not use the words historical materialism, but seems to have persisted in so-called economic determinism, that economic infrastructure determines superstructure. This manner of seeing things is correct if and only if one is deliberately engaged in an ex post facto analysis of history from a long perspective, and that is the only case. In his The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Max Weber stressed the importance of the role played by the religious Reformation qua superstructure in the development of industrial capitalism. But the religious Reformation itself could not have come into existence if not for the social transformation that had accompanied the osmosis of the commodity economy in the first place. Hence Weber's observation cannot wholly surpass the general thesis. Economic infrastructure determines superstructure. When observing historical events, however, one has to take into consideration various causalities at the same time. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels were extra cautious about this aspect. They insisted on seeing history rather from an empiricist standpoint, but in Britain such was not a new or innovative stance, but rather common at that time. For instance, at the end of the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith announced his future research project, which was never realized. In reading his idea, one discerns the kind of empiricism that could have developed into historical materialism. Marx. The historical materialism completed by Engels was therefore a view of history that had appeared thanks to the establishment of industrial capitalism. That is to say that industrial capitalism made the materialist view of seeing the historical past possible, while the view, historical materialism, cannot elucidate capitalism. The commodity economy under capitalism has itself a potency to organize the world, and this potency is in a sense an ideational power par excellence. So it is that the capitalist economy is not infrastructure per se, yet neither is it superstructure per se. In order to take the capitalist economy into account, one has to, once and for all, discard historical materialism's framework of infrasuperstructures. The movement of capitalism, as perverted a form as it may be, has an active aspect. As Marx pointed out in his theses on Feuerbach, it was Hegel, rather than positivist historians, who understood it clearly. For this reason, Marx returned to Hegel as soon as he began his critique of political economy work in the 1850s. In any event, it is true that Marx came after Engels in terms of historical materialism. This delay was due to his engagement in the critique of religion. He was seeking to grasp state and money as a sort of religion, and he never abandoned this project. Capital was written as a development of his earlier concerns. Therefore, what makes the German ideology so important is not its new view of history, but Marx's parallax caused by his delay. Engels wrote, "It has not occurred to any one of these philosophers to inquire into the connection of German philosophy with German reality, the relation of their criticism to their own material surroundings." 12. Then, what about Marx, who had been within the circle of German philosophy up until the moment his life in exile began? It had not occurred to him, either. This awareness that must have finally occurred to him, while reading the passage, must have been totally different from the flat and static scheme of historical materialism, namely, that German philosophy is determined by German material circumstances. What finally struck Marx outside Germany was the pronounced parallax. Then, in 1844 in Paris, Marx wrote in The Holy Family, "The Maître d'École describes correctly the condition to which isolation from the outer world reduces a man. For one to whom the sensuously perceptible world becomes a mere idea, for him mere ideas are transformed into sensuously perceptible beings. The figments of his brain assume corporeal form. A world of tangible, palpable ghosts is begotten within his mind. That is the secret of all pious visions, and at the same time it is the general form of insanity." German idealism was established at the point that the moment of sensibility qua passivity was discarded, and, as Marx criticized, what it created was little more than a world of pious visions or insanity. But what Marx stresses here is beyond the matter of the philosophical stance per se. To this transcritical Marx, the positionality, whether or not materialist, radical, concerned with exteriority, and so on, makes little difference if it is caught within an enclosed discursive system. All in all, what isolates thinkers, including Marx himself, from the outer world is neither national frontier nor psychosis, but each his own discursive system, and this fact strikes them only when they are dislocated and out of the system. This outside is not another positionality. However, Marx is not criticizing the idealism from a certain new positionality. For Marx's transcritical materialism exists only in the parallax between idealism and empiricism. If the parallax is lost, that is, if it turns out to be a positionality, even materialism will be another optical illusion. To use Kant's term, Marx continues, "Whilst in ordinary life every shopkeeper is very well able to distinguish between what somebody professes to be and what he really is, our historiography has not yet won even this trivial insight. It takes every epoch at its word and believes that everything it says and imagines about itself is true." 14. The Marxian Transcritique appears only in the awareness of the gap between what one thinks and what one really is. Marx, who had seen Germany from the outside, several years later came to see France from the outside. In contrast to the German scene, the discourses in France were not produced only within philosophers' fantasies, but in relationship with real political struggles. But here, too, it has not occurred to anyone to inquire into the connection of philosophy with reality, the relation of their criticism to their own material surroundings. They could not distinguish between the illusions about their achievements and the actual achievements, Marx themselves. In this sense, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte was written in the manner of the French ideology, as it were. 4.2 The system of representation, Darstellung and Vertretung. As Marx's transcritical stance revealed, German ideologues thought and spoke under the design of Hegelian philosophy. Things were not the same, however, vis-à-vis French ideologues. Expressing themselves as representatives of political parties, they were less speculative than practical, and yet, in the minds of everyone, participants and observers alike, the process of the real political events dating from February 24, 1848 to December 2, 1851, appeared as an incomprehensible, uncanny dream. To Marx, it was self-evident that at the substratum of the series of events, the drama, were the social classes and their struggles. But what he sought in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte was not to point out the base structure, but to illuminate the way the political process was formed by a dreamlike metamorphosis. The primary characteristic of the affair was that the dramatic personae were dressed in the linguistic costume of the First French Revolution, and further that the whole event came to be resolved along the plot lines of the past affair. In order to decode the new affair, that notoriously resulted in the inauguration of Louis Bonaparte as emperor, simply pointing out the infrastructure was obviously insufficient. Thus Marx employed the process of the First French Revolution as an a priori form, so to speak, that constituted the process of events. Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something that has never yet existed, precisely in such periods of revolutionary crisis they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service and borrow from them names, battle cries and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time-honored disguise and his borrowed language. Thus Luther donned the mask of the Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than to parody. Now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793 to 1795.15. It was the ghosts and ideas from the past that were ruling the parties of the time. They could understand what they were doing only in terms of the past, that is, they were dominated by the historical words and phrases, language. If so, it was isomorphic to what Marx pointed out with respect to the German philosophers, that they were too eager to fiddle with Hegelian problems and criticize Hegel by expanding this or that detail of the Hegelian system, but that they were finally little more than an undersized representation, a farce, of Hegel himself. While Hegel at least posed a system of thought outright, the young Hegelians, merely as his chorus, were obsessed with arguments, ostensibly grandiose, but in actuality empty and fruitless. For the German philosophers, the Hegelian system as the tradition of all the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain. The 18th Brumaire thus performed a dexterous satire of Hegel's philosophy of history. In the process of the political drama of 1848 to 1851, Louis, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, came to hold the seat of power by resorting to that very same illusion of the world historical individual, and this notwithstanding that he had no ideal nor assignment to be realized other than his given role, to repress, as long as possible, the contradictions inherent in the capitalist economy by way of state intervention. In this manner, Louis Bonaparte became the enduring prototype for all counter-revolutionaries, including 20th-century fascists. What Marx paid attention to most in this text was the aspect that this particular process of events came into existence within the parliamentary system as a given. The Revolution of February, 1848 delivered universal suffrage for the first time, and this was accomplished under the republicanism that had abolished the monarchy. The process that was brought to a close by the installment of Petit Louis the Emperor could have occurred only under the bourgeois parliamentary system. Marx pointed out the existence of the real social classes behind the representation. Later, Engels again attributed to Marx the discovery that behind the ideological representations there exists the economic class structure, and that the struggle between classes is driven by the law of history. Reading the text closely, however, what Marx discovered in the series of events was quite the reverse. The conjunctures developed independent of, or even contrary to, the economic class structure. What he sought to elucidate were the autonomous operations of events as such, and the agent of the operations was obviously the institution of the representative system itself. In the parliamentary system based upon universal suffrage, The representative system is thoroughly fictitious as compared to Ständeversammlung, an assembly of different castes professions from pre-industrial Europe, as Hans Kelsen later claimed, that is to say that there is no apodictic rapport between the representer and the represented in the institution of representatives. The point Marx stressed here was that the acts and discourses of political parties were independent of the real classes, or to use Kenneth Burke's expression in the Grammar of Motives, the real classes are little more than class unconsciousness 17, which can come into consciousness as classes only in the discursive arena of political parties. In the following passage, Marx explains the arbitrariness of the relation between representer and represented. Just as little must one imagine that the democratic representatives are indeed all shopkeepers or enthusiastic champions of shopkeepers. In their education and individual position they may be as far apart as heaven from earth. What makes them representatives of the petty bourgeoisie is the fact that in their minds they do not get beyond the limits which the latter do not get beyond in life, that they are consequently driven, theoretically, to the same problems and solutions to which material interest and social position drive the latter in practice. This is, in general, the relationship between the political and literary representatives of a class and the class they represent. And elsewhere, he says, the parliamentary party was not only dissolved into its two great factions, each of these factions was not only split up within itself, but the party of order in parliament had fallen out with the party of order outside parliament, the spokesmen and scribes of the bourgeoisie, its platform and its press, in short, the ideologists of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie itself, the representatives and the represented, were alienated from one another and no longer understood each another. Only because the relationship between the representative and the represented is arbitrary was it possible that the industrial bourgeoisie as well as other classes could abandon their representatives and choose Louis Bonaparte. At the point in time of February 24, 1848, parties existed as representatives of classes, namely, they appeared as difference in the discursive arena. In only 3 years, however, Bonaparte somehow seized power as the representative of all. Marx refused to ascribe this to the person of Bonaparte, his ideals, politics, psychology, or character. No matter what kind of scope one employs, it is impossible to decode the enigma of Bonaparte, who was a nobody 3 years before, who came to seize the throne of emperor. As Marx says in Capital, it is easy to see that money is a commodity, but the challenge is to figure out how a commodity becomes money. It is the same conundrum that Marx observed vis-à-vis Bonaparte, as opposed to Victor Hugo, who confines himself to bitter and witty invective against the responsible publisher of the coup d'état. Marx declares he would demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. 20. To be certain, no matter how many times one repeats criticism like Hugo's, it does not amount to a criticism of anything. Nonetheless, neither can Marx's enigma, how it is possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part, be elucidated by resorting to the class struggle, that the representative system exists autonomously, that classes come into consciousness only via this system, and that the system is porous. Here exists the enigma that made Bonaparte emperor. According to Engels, it was precisely Marx who had first discovered the great law of motion of history, the law according to which all historical struggles, whether they proceed in political, religious, philosophical or some other ideological domain, are in fact only the more or less clear expression of struggles of social classes. 21. But, as Wataru Hiramatsu observed, as far as such a stance is concerned, Marx should have been Engels's before Marx's. The crucial point here is that social classes can appear as they are only by way of the discourses, and not in the least according to the great law of motion of history. But Marx also points to the existence of a class which, without representatives, without discourses that speak for their class interest, has to be represented by someone totally unrelated to them. Insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interests and their culture from those of the other classes, and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among these small-holding peasants, and the identity of their interests begets no community, no national bond and no political organization among them, they do not form a class. They are consequently incapable of enforcing their class interest in their own name, whether through a parliament or through a convention. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. Their representative must at the same time appear as their master, as an authority over them, as an unlimited governmental power that protects them against the other classes and sends them rain and sunshine from above. The political influence of the smallholding peasants, therefore, finds its final expression in the executive power subordinating society to itself. The fact was that the smallholding peasants who first appeared on the political stage supported Bonaparte, but they welcomed him not as their representative but as their emperor. We have seen that, especially from the 20th century onward, this class has welcomed and supported fascism most fervently, but more crucially, it was the system of representative democracy that gave them this role in the political theater. For instance, Hitler's regime came into existence from within the ideal representative system of the Weimar Republic. A fact unknown to the West and often ignored is that the Emperor Fascism of Japan appeared only after the realization of universal suffrage in 1928. In the 1930s in Europe, Marxists considered Hitler simply as an agent for the bourgeois economy, seeking to save it from crisis, and thought it would be enough to reveal that infrastructural fact. Like the Nazis, Marxists also found the Weimar Congress deceitful. But the masses gradually chose to be represented by Nazism, as opposed to Marxists' expectations. This cannot be explained merely by the effects of Nazis' shrewd manipulation of passion and violence combined. From the beginning, the Communist Party was also one of the representatives which could not claim any apodictic connection with the represented, the proletariat. With the experiences of the failure of the revolution after World War I and the resulting fascism, the relative autonomy of superstructure became one of the Marxists' key concepts. In criticizing the Marxists of the time, Wilhelm Reich used psychoanalytic theory to find the cause of Germans being drawn to Nazism. It was there he discovered the authoritarian family ideology and its sexual repression. Later, the Frankfurt School introduced psychoanalysis into the analysis of the mechanism of fascism. 2. In this context, psychoanalysis definitely became a new tool for analyzing superstructure. In order to tackle fascism, however, one should rather return first to the 18th Brumaire. In this text, Marx almost preempted the Freudian stance of the interpretation of dreams. He analyzes the series of dreamlike events that occurred during the period of time, emphasizing not the dream thoughts, that is, expressions of real class relations, but the dream work. How class unconscious is condensed and transferred, for that matter, to the favor of our transcritical view. Freud himself used the metaphor of the representative system in his new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. The dream is seen to be an abbreviated selection from the associations, a selection made, it is true, according to rules that we have not yet understood. The elements of the dream are like representatives chosen by election from a mass of people. There can be no doubt that by our technique we have got hold of something for which the dream is a substitute and in which lies the dream's psychical value, but which no longer exhibits its puzzling peculiarities, its strangeness and its confusion. Freud himself likens dream work to a Congress elected by universal suffrage. If so, instead of introducing psychoanalysis into an analysis of Marx's text, we should rather read psychoanalysis from the standpoint of the 18th Brumaire. Thus fascism qua Bonapartism is revealed in its most crucial dynamism. A collapse of representation is the solution to the unrepresentable. Louis Althusser made an effort to explain the relative autonomy of superstructure with the concept of overdetermination, borrowed Marx from Lacanian theory, as opposed to the conventional economic determinism. In my opinion, this is a general theoretical reinterpretation of historical materialism, and thereby lacks the moment to analyze concrete facts and situations. In contrast, Marx's analytical device in the 18th Brumaire is much more specific and intricate. What he is pointing to is the duplicity of the representational system itself. On the one hand there is Congress qua legislative power, and on the other there is presidency qua administrative power. The latter is chosen by the direct vote of the people. But the difference between a Congress and presidency lies not merely in the way they are elected. As Carl Schmitt explained, the parliamentary system is liberalistic in the sense that it governs through discussion, while the presidency is democratic in the sense that it represents the general will. Schmitt further states that dictatorship contradicts liberalism but not necessarily democracy. Bolshevism and fascism by contrast are, like all dictatorships, certainly anti-liberal but not necessarily anti-democratic. The will of the people can be expressed just as well and perhaps better through acclamation, through something taken for granted, an obvious and unchallenged presence, than through the statistical apparatus that has been constructed with such meticulousness in the last 50 years. 27. This problematic consciousness had already been explicit in Rousseau. who had derisively criticized the British Parliament, a representative system as follows. My argument, then, is that sovereignty, being nothing other than the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and that the sovereign, which is simply a collective being, cannot be represented by anyone but itself. Power may be delegated, but the will cannot be. If a people promises simply and solely to obey, it dissolves itself by that very pledge. It ceases to be a people, for once there is a master, there is no longer a sovereign, and the body politics is therefore annihilated. 28. Following the example of Greek direct democracy, Rousseau disparaged the representative system. This position would result either in the Hegelian stance that saw the general will not in the parliament but in another administrative power, the bureaucrat, or in the urge to replace the parliamentary representative system with the directness of a national referendum. Furthermore, the problematic of the political representative system corresponds to the larger problematic of representation. The difference between parliament and presidency as representational forms corresponds to that of epistemological representations. That is, on one hand, there is the Cartesian position, that truth can be deduced from a priori clear evidence, and on the other hand, there is the position common in Anglo-American philosophy, that truth can exist only as a tentative hypothesis attained by agreement among others. In the political context, the former is equal to the idea that the general will is represented by being beyond conflicting individuals and classes, while the latter is equal to the idea that the general will must consistently be determined by agreement through discussion. What is clear is that, as with Heidegger's discontent, both are modernist thoughts, seeking truth not directly but only via representation. Heidegger radically criticized both positions, and politically, he denied both presidency and parliament. To him, truth had to be disclosed directly by being via a poet-thinker, the Führer. In such a context, Heidegger insisted that the national referendum Hitler organized should not be an election to choose representatives, but a direct revelation. But, in my context, this is another form of representation, and perhaps its ultimate collapse, an imaginary and aesthetic synthesis of the split of the contradicting classes. What Heidegger insisted was that the Führer be an emperor to whom the nation pays obeisance as their master, rather than its representative elected via a national referendum. In the story of Bonaparte's victory, one sees precisely the first instance of the crisis of representation and the imaginary sublation of the contradictions therein. In this sense, the 18th Brumaire takes in advance the essential elements of political crises that thereafter appeared and reappeared. Marx, then, what does an emperor who is neither parliament nor president embody? Nothing other than the state. The bourgeois state is constituted by overthrowing the absolutist monarchy. Its nature is that by exhibiting constitutionalism and the representative system, it conceals the substantive ingredients of the state, including its bureaucratic and military organizations. The executive power with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its extensive and artificial state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000. This appalling parasitic body, which enmeshes the body of French society like a net and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the days of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of feudal system, which it helped to hasten. 30. Precisely as money is deemed the means to represent commodities' value, in the bourgeois state, bureaucracy and the army appear to belong to the organ that represents the will of the nation. At moments of crises, however, the state in itself appears, precisely as, in economic crises, money in itself appears. Marx continues, only under the second Bonaparte does the state seem to have made itself completely independent. As against civil society, the state machine has consolidated its position so thoroughly. 31. That is to say that when the bourgeois economy reaches a deadlock, the state organ intervenes under the name of the emperor. In Capital, Marx registered only three classes: capitalists, landowners, and wage workers. These are sheer aliases of the economic categories: capital, ground rent, and labor power commodity, and the real formations of the social hierarchy are much more complex than this triad. Even in Britain, which Marx selected for his model, there was no such tripartite division. Rather, various classes, including all the dead generations, existed in reality. In France, worse still, there were few industrial laborers in 1848, and those whom Marx called proletariat in the 18th Brumaire were very much those craftsmen who turned radical, having been deprived of their jobs by the osmosis of British industrial capital. This is why they too ended up supporting Louis Bonaparte, the Saint-Simonist on horseback. whose slogans were state-led economic development and social welfare. What Marx sought to present in Capital was not the prospect that the development of industrial capital would lead to the tripartite class division, but the principles of the capitalist economy that are overlooked under the complex formation of the real social hierarchy. This division, therefore, should not be mechanically employed as a scheme for actual historical development. By scrutinizing the French experience in the 18th Brumaire, Marx grasps class and class struggle as difference forming a polymorphous complex, and politics as a matter of discursive and representative aparity. He also, however, offers a principal reflection upon the relationship between state and capital, taking France as a model. In his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels stated that Marx's thought consisted of German philosophy, French socialism, and English political economy. I would rather say that it really exists in his Transcritique between them. Written in a journalistic style, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte yet offers a principal reflection, different from yet certainly as important as the one in Capital, the critique of nation-state economics. It should be read as the critique of national politics, as it were. To conclude this chapter on political representation, I would like to touch upon what dictatorship of the bourgeoisie meant to Marx, because it is certainly not irrelevant to his dictatorship of the proletariat. It is crucial to note that Marx saw a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in universal suffrage, the backdrop of the coup of the 18th Brumaire, rather than a direct violent means of rule. It is a system wherein people of all classes participate in the elections, but that is not all. At the same time, and inversely, in this system, all individuals are, for the first time, separated in principle from all class relations and relations of production. The representative assembly had already existed in the feudal system as well as in the absolutist monarchy, but it was at the point when universal suffrage and then secret balloting were introduced that the representative assembly turned into the unequivocal bourgeois parliament, hiding who votes who for whom. Secret voting liberates people from their relations. At the same time, however, it erases the traces of their relations. Thus the relationship between representative and represented is radically severed once, and becomes arbitrary. So it is that the representative chosen by secret balloting is no longer controlled by the represented. In other words, the representative can behave as if he represented everyone, even though that is not the case. That is the nature of dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. It is not quite the same as the bourgeois class running society by occupying the parliament. Rather, it is a mechanism that erases class relations or the relations of domination by temporarily reducing people into free and equal individuals, and this mechanism itself functions as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. In elections, the freedom of individuals is guaranteed, but this exists only at the moment that the hierarchical relations in the real relations of production are suspended. So it is that there is no democracy sensu stricto in capitalist enterprises. Outside elections, that is to say, managers are not elected by employees, and furthermore not by their secret voting, and it is impossible that state bureaucrats are elected by people's direct voting. People's freedom exists only to the extent that they can choose their representatives in political elections, and, in reality, universal suffrage is just an elaborate ritual to give a public consensus to what has already been determined by the state apparity. 4.3 The economic crisis is a parallax. Now living in exile in England and dealing with British discourse, Marx could no longer rely on his previous approaches. He had to shift his stance once more. In confronting German and French ideologues, it was significant and even imperative to invoke the economic class structure that was repressed in their discourses, whereas in British discourse, the very empiricist stance that he had posed against German philosophers and the very economic problematic that he had introduced against French ideologues were dominant. There is no doubt that the economic problematic was the veiled infrastructure in the idealist tradition, but it was not veiled in the English context. Class struggles over economic interests were especially manifest in the climate of the mid to late 19th century. Both classical economists and Ricardian socialists had been approaching the problematics of society and history via the explicitly economic standpoint. In fact, the issue concerning the exploitation of surplus value, the very notion that is believed to have been coined by Marx, had already been posed by the Ricardian socialists. The most crucial problem Marx encountered in England was the potential for crisis inherent in the capitalist society. In classical economics, there is no crisis in principle. If it were acknowledged, it would only signify misfortune or a failure of economic policy. Classical economists disclaimed the fetishism of money inherent in their predecessor, mercantilism. To them, money was merely a denominator of the value of commodity, that is, of the labor objectified in the commodity or the social labor time. Ricardo writes, productions are always bought by productions, or by services. Money is only the medium by which the exchange is effected. 32. The enlightenment of the political economy in this sense had been accomplished long before Marx, and it is precisely the real occasions of economic crisis that derided such enlightenment thinking. Marx described the nature of crisis. Such a crisis occurs only where the ongoing chain of payments has been fully developed, along with an artificial system for setting them. Whenever there is a general disturbance of the mechanism, no matter what its cause, money suddenly and immediately changes over from its merely nominal shape, money of account, into hard cash. Profane commodities can no longer replace it. The use value of commodities becomes valueless, and their value vanishes in the face of their own form of value. The bourgeois, drunk with prosperity and arrogantly certain of himself, has just declared that money is a purely imaginary creation. Commodities alone are money, he said. But now the opposite cry resounds over the markets of the world. Only money is a commodity. As the heart pants after fresh water, so pants his soul after money, the only wealth. In a crisis, the antithesis between commodities and their value form, money, is raised to the level of an absolute contradiction. Hence money's form of appearance is here also a matter of indifference. The monetary famine remains whether payments have to be made in gold or in credit money, such as bank notes. Taking such a phenomenon in consideration, one can no longer criticize the illusion of the capitalist economy or the illusion of money by invoking substance, such as products or labor. For, at the very moment of crisis, the moment the fantasy collapses, it is money to which people throng. The magic of money that Ricardo was thought to have liquidated, here returns. The first of the crises hit in 1819, soon after Ricardo published the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in Marx 1817. The crisis hit precisely as the most radical critique of his economic theory. Although money had been at work in reality in the capitalist economy, it was theoretically cremated. In his critique of classical economics, Marx thus reintroduced the money they had eliminated in their Enlightenment. Money was thoroughly absent from the perspective of classical economics. Adam Smith was well aware that the developments of commodity exchange and division of labor transform society, but he overlooked the fact that both are rendered only by money, and furthermore, only as a movement of capital. Smith wrongly believed that the worldwide division of labor, constantly being organized and reorganized by merchant capital, had existed since the very onset of economic history, and it followed that money was deemed by him a mere barometer or medium. The classical economist's labor theory of value negated the dimension proper to commodity exchange and conceptually reduced the source of value to production in general. It cast a perspective by which to see pre-capitalist societies from the vantage point of production and relation of production, namely, from the viewpoint of historical materialism, thereby overlooking the dimension proper to the capitalist economy. Capital is a kind of self-increasing, self-reproductive money. Marx's first formulation of this is MCM. It represents the activity of merchant capital, with which usurer's capital, MM, is made possible. According to Marx, merchant's capital and usurer's capital are antediluvian forms of capital. The formulation of merchant's capital is nevertheless also consistent with industrial capital. The main point of difference is that in industrial capital the content of C is a complex entity, that is, CMPL. Thus, in Marx's equation, the movement of industrial capital is MM. At the stage at which industrial capital became dominant, a divergence occurred. Merchant's capital came to be merely commercial capital, while usurer's capital became bank or financial capital. But, in order to consider capital in the full sense, one should always start from the consideration of the process MCM. For capital is equal to the whole process of the transubstantiation or metamorphosis. Seen from a different angle, this process is also the process of circulation, CM and MC, the domain where it appears that only commodity exchange via money is taking place, so much so that money is merely a measure of value albeit a means of purchase and payment. What Adam Smith and David Ricardo both sought to elucidate was a mechanism that equilibrates and adjusts the division of labor and exchange. This theoretical inclination was shared by both classical and neoclassical economists. What they omitted was the fact that expansions of division of labor and exchange happen only as the self-reproductive movement of capital money. Whether classical or neoclassical, economists tend to give primary importance to the production of wealth by division of labor and the exchange of wealth, things which are merely the tail end of capital's movement. To Adam Smith, that people pursue their own profits is consequently beneficial to the whole. He attributed it to the auto-adjustment mechanism, the invisible hands, in the marketplace. On the other hand, Marx located a salto mortale in MCM, at the moment CM is realized or not, that is, the moment when it is determined whether or not the commodity is sold. In order to escape the critical moment and continue its self-reproductive movement, capital has to create an artificial pact of presuming that the commodity has already been sold. This is so-called credit. Crisis is not caused merely by an accumulation of the discouraging outcome of commodities not being sold, but very much by a forced revelation, at the moment of final liquidation, that commodities that are supposed to have been sold have not been sold in reality. Crisis is caused by the overheating of credit, and this phenomenon has existed since before the advent of industrial capitalism. In England, German idealism was mainly despised. Before he came to England, Marx himself had been scorning the speculative philosophy that began with Fichte, that considered ego and spirit as autopotically creating the world, as a case of insanity isolated from the outer world. But, ironically, in England there was an uncanny coincidence between the real and the eidetic. Their money-dealing capital was autonomous, precisely like the ego and spirit. As a self-increasing entity, the investors thought it a matter of course that they got interest from their savings as well as dividends from their stock. Marx investments, that is to say that speculative philosophy turned into a daily event, as it were. The drive for expansion without production and circulation is like the drive for metaphysics in Kantian philosophy, namely, the expansion of cognition without synthetic judgment. The motive drive of usurer's capital is precisely such. Marx spoke of interest-bearing capital as follows. The formula further expresses the fact that it is the exchange value, not the use value, that is the decisive inherent purpose of the movement. It is precisely because the money form of value is its independent and palpable form of appearance that the circulation form which starts and finishes with actual money, expresses money-making, the driving motive of capitalist production. Most palpably, the production process appears simply as an unavoidable middle term, a necessary evil for the purpose of money-making. 35. Credit and speculation appear to be frivolous, secondary things. However, it is they that regulate the production process in reality. Occasions of crisis reveal that, but classical economists and their followers turned a blind eye to the parallax that crises deliver. It was Marx who intervened to tackle the truth of capitalism vis-à-vis the parallax. The truth I mean is nevertheless nothing like the so-called evils of capitalism, which others had pointed out long before Marx. Adam Smith was well aware that the capitalist economy rendered a class division between the haves and have-nots. Therefore, he proposed a sort of welfare economics based upon sympathy, at the same time as affirming the inevitable egoism of individuals. Hegel, as well, pointed out the evil effects of civil society and insisted that they be solved by the power of state. Meanwhile, socialists like Robert Owen and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon more radically stated that the capitalist economy could exist thanks to the exploitation of surplus labor. However, their recognition of the capitalist economy was not far from that of the classical economists whom they attacked. For that matter, even Marx himself was, up until the mid-1850s, not much better than these others. He had believed that crisis would ultimately collapse the capitalist society, but it was after this hoping for the day theory failed that his understanding of capitalism deepened. Up until then, Marx had thought that crises would occur due to the anarchic impetus of capitalist production, that the crises would break down the capitalist economy and then a revolution would take place to finally expunge the crises as illness. From this derived Engels and Lenin's idea to solve the crises by way of a planned economy. As we all know now, even though the planned economy might succeed in avoiding crisis, it would inevitably cause another illness. Crisis is a chronic disease inherent in the capitalist economy, yet also a solution to its internal defects. In other words, capitalism makes temporary repairs to its innate problem by crises. Thus it will never collapse because of it. It can be compared with hysteria, the springboard of Freudian psychoanalysis. For an ill patient, hysteria is itself a solution, thanks to which the patient's stability is secured for the time being. But, for Freud, What was more crucial than hysteria was the mechanism of unconscious that would cause it, which exists in a person whether or not he or she is ill. In the same way, for Marx, crisis was no longer the terminator of capitalist economy. It became important only because it would reveal the truth of the capitalist economy that is invisible in the everyday economy. Thus Marx's stance on seeing the capitalist economy by way of the pronounced parallax provoked by the crisis. Marx wrote Capital in conformity with Hegelian logic, wherein the status of capital is very similar to that of spirit. Capital is nevertheless nothing like a materialistic inversion of the Hegelian system. In his attempt to grasp crisis as an innate element in capitalism, it required Marx take a completely non-Hegelian viewpoint. This was, I insist, the transcendental standpoint. In Kantian philosophy, crisis would function like a critique of capital Geist that seeks to self-expand over its boundaries. Thus for Marx to elucidate the drive of capitalism, what was required was a kind of transcendental retrospection. In this aspect, Marxian critique comes close to psychoanalysis. In his philosophy of spirit of the Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel sees illness as a symptom of clinging to a lower stage in spirit's development. In a sense, Freud's account of psychosis is subsumed in this position, but Freud's method was not simply to conduct a retrospective or belated search into the lower stage. He also presented how normal development is achieved by a forgetting of the trauma of having encountered crisis. In a similar framework, Marx comments on classical economics. The unceasing fight of modern economists against the monetary and mercantile systems is mainly provoked by the fact that the secret of bourgeois production, i.e., that it is dominated by exchange value, is divulged in a naively brutal way by these systems. Political economy errs in its critique of the monetary and mercantile systems when it assails them as mere illusions, as utterly wrong theories, and fails to notice that they contain in a primitive form its own basic presuppositions. In the well-advanced industrial capitalism, the naively brutal way is oppressed, except when, in crises, a return of the repressed occurs. The ideology of what economists refer to as the healthy market economy denies the previously existing naively brutal ways, but it sits on top of them. Hence, in the style of Hegelian logic, Marx describes the development of industrial capitalism, from commodity to money, from money to merchant capital, from merchant capital to industrial capital. Nevertheless, when one reads it, one should do so backward. In his description, the development is not a sublation of contradictions, as commonly believed, but the development is a repression of contradictions. Our task vis-à-vis capital is thus to elucidate what is erased in the most advanced stage and appears only in crises. By conducting a retrospective belated search into the archaic form of capital, what is at stake here is not the historical origin. It is the archae as a form whose traces remain in the already complete capitalist economy. In England, where classical economics and empiricist historiography were dominant, Marx rediscovered Hegel. It was in such a context that Marx professed himself to be Hegel's disciple. Paradoxically, however, it was in this period that Marx was criticizing Hegel most radically, much more than during the period he was technically criticizing various details of Hegelian philosophy. In fact, the book entitled Capital, The Critique of National Economics could have been entitled Capital, The Critique of Hegelian Philosophy of Right. People refer back to Hegelian philosophy in order to approach capital, because it is written in the framework of Hegelian logic. But Hegel's elements of the philosophy of right, for instance, has its own historical limit. It was an attempt to ground, from the vantage point of exchange and contract, the trinity of capital nation-state when the capitalist economy came to organize the greater part of modern Western society, namely, the trinity was completed therein. Within such a historicity, Hegel saw the market economy as a system of wants. That is to say, he could not see the market economy as formed by a perverted drive of capitalism. In this sense, he was within the same confinement as the classical economists. Meanwhile, Marx's insight was that the capitalist economy is a system of illusion, that it is driven by the movement MCM, and that at its fountainhead is the drive to accumulate money, in distinction from the wants and desire to achieve wealth. To achieve this objective, he returned to value form. Therefore, capital's similarity to the Hegelian system should not confuse us. After writing Grundrisse, Marx commented in retrospect on his own doctoral dissertation in a letter to Ferdinand Lassalle. During this time of tribulation I carefully perused your Heraclitus. Your reconstruction of the system from the scattered fragments I regard as brilliant. nor was I any less impressed by the perspicacity of your polemic. I am all the more aware of the difficulties you had to surmount in this work, in that about 18 years ago I myself attempted a similar work on a far easier philosopher, Epicurus, namely the portrayal of a complete system from fragments, a system which I am convinced, by the by, was, as with Heraclitus, only implicitly present in his work, not consciously as a system. Even in the case of philosophers who give systematic form to their work, Spinoza for instance, the true inner structure of the system is quite unlike the form in which it was consciously presented by him. But, arrestingly, the same mechanism can be observed in Marx's own work. The true inner structure of the system in Capital is quite unlike the form in which it was consciously presented by him. Here exists the very moment when the transcendental critique of reason Capital intervenes. Capital should be read as such. Marx. One of the most acclaimed impressions about Capital is that it is historical and at the same time logical, but rather this proves it to be neither. The history that Capital grasps is distinct from the history that historical materialism grasps. Marx's objective, unlike that of Engels and others, did not exist in explaining the historical whole via the so-called economic infrastructure. What he sought to grasp was history insofar as it is organized by the monetary economy. He discovered thus that the capitalist market economy transformed the whole world, and that the source of its power was the self-reproductive drive of capital. History in this sense is logical, because it is that which is organized by the economic category, but at the same time, the economic category in Capital never does logically self-realize like the Hegelian concept. Its development is always preceded by real historical events. Before dealing with industrial capitalism, Marx gives a long positivist reflection on primitive accumulation. The transformation from merchant capital to industrial capital is formally that from MCM to MM, but for this to happen, the separation between the means of production and the laborer, namely, the commodification of labor power, must have taken place. This transformation, once seen as an economic category, appears to be quite smooth and clear. Nevertheless, for this formal development to occur, the real historical process has to be taken into consideration as a sine qua non. Marx never belittled the historical contingent given, except that he employed the category of the capitalist economy as that which offers form to the contents. Only to this extent can it be said that he brackets the givens. The real capitalist economy primarily exists encompassed within states. It is states that frame the commodity economy. But the commodity economy coexists along with various productions and classes that are not formally subsumed in its category. Marx brackets non-capitalist production as well as state intervention. Namely, he treats them as if they were already internalized, because they ultimately have to follow the principles of the capitalist economy. Because the capitalist economy has the potency to constantly involve its externality and turn it into its internal given. Such is the autonomous potency of the capitalist economy, and it is never identifiable as infrastructure. Marx's lifelong assignment was to shed light on the secret of this potency. 4.4 The micro difference. There have been many disputes over assessments of early and late Marx. One was a tendency to appreciate the alienation theory of early Marx as opposed to the economic determinism of later Marx. Counter to this, Althusser stressed the epistemological break that occurred in the period of the German ideology. There is an important aspect of Marx that both of the tendencies overlooked, that is, the critique of Marx, or Marx as a critic. As I have been pointing out, Marx's thought could not have been formed if not for the incessant transpositions and turns, and it is wrong to induce some essential philosophy out of it. In his doctoral dissertation, Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature in General, written before his economic and philosophical manuscript, Marx had already presented his critical stance. In this, Marx sees the difference between Democritus and Epicurus in terms of their philosophies of nature. It is common sense that there are large differences in their philosophies, yet in their philosophies of nature they were very similar. Epicurus modified Democritus' mechanical determinism by introducing the concept of the swerve of the atom away from the straight line. This had been considered as a diversion, rather than a serious development. Marx, on the other hand, sought to prove that the difference between their philosophical systems derived precisely from this micro-difference. The uniqueness of Marx's method in his dissertation lies in that it speaks of the difference between Democritus and Epicurus in their almost identical philosophies of nature rather than the whole of their philosophies. Indeed, on the one hand it is an old and entrenched prejudice to identify Democritean and Epicurean physics, so that Epicurus' modifications are seen as only arbitrary vagaries. On the other hand, I am forced to go into what seem to be microscopic examinations as far as details are concerned. But precisely because this prejudice is as old as the history of philosophy, Marx, because the differences are so concealed that they can be discovered as it were only with a microscope, it will be all the more important if, despite the interdependence of Democritean and Epicurean physics, an essential difference extending to the smallest details can be demonstrated. What can be demonstrated in the small can even more easily be shown where the relations are considered in larger dimensions, while conversely very general considerations leave doubt whether the result will hold when applied to details. Marx intended to break down the prejudice, as old as the history of philosophy, that determined Epicurus' modifications as arbitrary vagaries, or more to the point, he challenged the topos of identification itself that erased their differences. A similar method might be observed in our reading of his own Capital. When writing the book, Marx inherited so many thoughts from classical economics that neoclassical economists customarily regard Capital as a variation of Ricardo's work. This claim is not totally incorrect as far as his work up until Grundrisse is concerned. But Capital renders an element radically different from before. The theory of value form in the opening of Capital is initiated by Marx's serious consideration of Bailey's critique of Ricardo's labor theory of value. Hence Capital should be read not only in its difference from Ricardo but also from Bailey, the true originator of neoclassical economics. This interstice between them was one of the most significant stages for Marx's Transcritique. When contrasting Democritus and Epicurus, Marx was also keeping in mind another philosopher, Aristotle. On one pole Marx placed Democritus, who was a sensationalist, mechanical determinist, and also a skeptic as a result, while on the opposite pole he posited Aristotle, a teleologist and rationalist. The intermundia was traversed by Epicurus, a proto-transcritic insisting upon the swerve or declination of the atom. According to Marx, it is this declination of the atom that renders a transmutation that is beyond being just mechanistic. For Marx, Epicurus is thus the one who criticizes both teleology and mechanical determinism by way of gazing into the swerve of the atomic movement. In the age when dissertations had to be written strictly about the classics, it was only natural that contemporary problematic concerns were superimposed therein. There is no doubt that Marx was really problematizing his contemporary materialism and idealism. Moreover, his Epicurus is reminiscent of Kant, who criticized both Hume and Leibniz from their intermundia. In this phase Marx was Kantian par excellence. But this was not because Marx consciously followed Kant, rather the opposite. It was his own engagement that brought him close to Kant. It was because Marx himself lived Transcritique. One observes the same gaze in his preface to the first edition of Capital. The value form, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very simple and slight in content. Nevertheless, the human mind has sought in vain for more than 2,000 years to get to the bottom of it, while on the other hand there has been at least an approximation to a successful analysis of forms which are much richer in content and more complex. Why? Because the complete body is easier to study than its cells. Moreover, in the analysis of economic forms neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of assistance. The power of abstraction must replace both. But for bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor, or the value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but so similarly does microscopic anatomy. What distinguishes Capital from previous work lies in the introduction of the microscopic view vis-à-vis the theory of value form. This had not existed in Grundrisse of the 1850s or in a contribution to the critique of political economy of the early 1860s. One should read the micro-difference between Capital and these previous works, because what can be demonstrated in the small can even more easily be shown where the relations are considered in larger dimensions. The conviction that Marx's important break occurred only once has made us overlook how crucial this shift was. Here is another example concerning the movement of Marx's thinking. Written in 1843, before economic and philosophical manuscripts. In investigating a situation concerning the state one is all too easily tempted to overlook the objective nature of the circumstances and to explain everything, Marx by the will of the persons concerned. However, there are circumstances which determine the actions of private persons and individual authorities, and which are as independent of them as the method of breathing. If from the outset we adopt this objective standpoint, we shall not assume good or evil will, exclusively on one side or the other. but we shall see the effect of circumstances where at first glance only individuals seem to be acting. Once it is proved that a phenomenon is made necessary by circumstances, it will no longer be difficult to ascertain the external circumstances in which it must actually be produced and those in which it could not be produced. Although the need for it already existed, this can be established with approximately the same certainty with which the chemist determines the external conditions under which substances having affinity are bound to form a compound. This position already prefigures the preface to Capital, where Marx explains his intention to regard both capitalist and landowner as personifications of economic categories, and thus not to question their subjective will and moral responsibility. Herein his natural historical standpoint is clearly present, and it is totally irrelevant to the influence of Feuerbach and the residue of Hegelian thought, no matter how crucial they were to Marx. But what I want to say is not that Marx was consistent from early on. To the contrary, I believe Marx's thinking should be read in reference to the micro-differences within similarities and proximities. Finally, Capital is undoubtedly the most important achievement of Marx's lifelong work, but one should not consider it his ultimate position. This is not merely because the book is unfinished, but more important because Marx persisted in criticizing dominant discourses within systems, from an external footing, constantly transposing and turning. Yet the external position is not something that exists substantively. This footing is the difference or the interstice between discourses which abrogates any standpoint. What is crucial here is Marx's transcritical footwork that opposes historical heterogeneity to idealism, while counterposing the autonomous power of category that constitutes reality to empiricism. This prompt transposition ultimately exceeds any self-same system of thought that can be attributed to him. It is counterproductive to look for a doctrine in his work. His thought and practice lie in his Transcritique. Finally, Marx was less a scholar of philosophy and political economy than a journalistic critic. 4.5 Marx and anarchists. Another aspect of Marx's ambiguity is his relation with the three anarchists, Bakunin, Proudhon, and Stirner. Bakunin incisively branded Marx as an authoritarian and dictatorial thinker, which became an established reputation among later anarchists. By contrast, Marxists formulated Marx as a thinker who entirely negated anarchism, but both overlooked the subtle difference in the Marxian critique of anarchism. For instance, Bakunin attacked Marx along with Lassalleans. That was Lassalle's program, and it is also the program of the Social Democratic Party. Strictly speaking, it belongs not to Lassalle but to Marx, who expressed it fully in the famous Manifesto of the Communist Party, which he and Engels published in 1848. Is it not clear that Lassalle's program is in no way different from that of Marx, whom he acknowledged as his teacher? 44 It must have been a big misunderstanding, if not outright slander. Bakunin ignores the deployment of Marx's thought during the 1860s and 1870s. Marx was critical of the idea to have the state protect and foster cooperative production. Marx was clear that the workers' desire to establish the conditions for cooperative production on a social scale, and first of all on a national scale, in their own country, only means that they are working to transform the present conditions of production, and it has nothing in common with the foundation of cooperative societies with state aid. But as far as the present cooperative societies are concerned, they are of value only insofar as they are the independent creations of the workers and not protégés either of the government or of the bourgeois. 45 In other words, Marx is stressing that the association of cooperatives itself must take place of the state, instead of state-led cooperative movements, whereby capital and state are to wither away. And this kind of proposition of principle aside, Marx never said anything in particular about future prospects. Marx extolled the Paris Commune mainly achieved by Proudhonists, and found in it possible communism, if united cooperative societies are to. 166 Marx regulate national production upon a common plan, thus taking it under their own control, and putting an end to the constant anarchy and periodical convulsions which are the fatality of capitalist production. What else, gentlemen, would it be but communism, possible communism? 46. This sort of association must be fundamentally different both from a traditional community and a state-centrist organization. It must correspond to what Marx called the social, that is, the form in which those who have once gotten out of communities are reassembled on a different level. In this sense, Communism is a project in attempt to shift the social relation that is formed as a result of capital's accumulative movement into the association of free and equal producers, and furthermore, into a global association of associations. In the third volume of Capital, Marx highly evaluated cooperatives side by side with stock company. He saw stock companies as the abolition of capital as private property within the confines of the capitalist mode of production itself. 47 This is because stock companies abolished the previous integrity of capitalists by the separation of capital and management, yet this is only a passive abolition of the capitalist system. The positive abolition is discovered by Marx in the producers' cooperative of which stockholders are workers themselves. In this context, Marx spoke of a new phase of individual property as opposed to private property, the capitalist mode of appropriation, which springs from the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of its proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a natural process, its own negation. This is the negation of negation. It does not re-establish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely, cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. What does this distinction between private property and individual property mean? Precisely because modern private ownership was that which was awarded by the absolutist state in exchange for paying taxes. Private ownership is equal to state ownership, so it is a total fallacy to abolish private property by means of state ownership. The abolition of private property must be an abolition of the state itself. To Marx, communism came to signify the establishment of a new kind of individual property, and this was because he considered communism as being equal to an association of producers' cooperatives. Such a view is obviously based upon Proudhon, whose book ch4 La Propriété that young Marx praised, is famous for its unhesitant vocation, La Propriété, c'est le volume. Yet Proudhon did not deny property in general. What he denied was earning income without working. So he distinguished between possession and property, and insisted on abolishing property. He believed that this revision would change every aspect of social institutions, law, politics, and economy. In addition, he never identified unearned profit with feudal plundering. What he calls unearned profit is rather intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production. For instance, each individual worker is paid wages for their work, but not for their joint work or increased production by their collective power, which goes to the capitalist. Adam Smith regarded this as a legitimate source of profit, but Proudhon regarded it as theft. Meanwhile, the left Ricardians in Britain had called it the exploitation of surplus value, while it motivated a vehement political labor movement there. In France, Proudhon was rather against political activity, advocating workers' partnerships where there could no longer be theft, at the same time as advocating a rise in productivity by cooperative work. He believed that the expansion of such an ethico-economic exchange system would replace capital and the state. In this light, it turns out that Marx never abandoned the basic ideas he had learned from Proudhon since his youth. What he called individual property in contrast to private property is no other than what Proudhon called possession. Marx did criticize Proudhon, but their relation should not be viewed from the later opposition between Marxism and anarchism, since between them was an intricate mutual reciprocity. In order to understand this situation, we should take into consideration the fissure between discursive systems in Britain, France, and Germany, and actual societies therein. In the 19th century, the labor movement and cooperatives began in Britain, this under the influence of the left Ricardians. Marx, who drew the idea of surplus value from Ricardo's labor value theory long before Proudhon drew the idea of profit theft from Smith. Exemplary works include Thomas Hodgskin's Political Economy, and William Thompson's An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth. These led to the Chartist movement. Another reason Proudhon believed it possible to dissolve capital and the state through workers' association without workers' political struggle was that, in 1830s France, industrial capitalism was underdeveloped and there were very few industrial workers. Saint-Simonism, which was then predominant, advocated development of industry and redistribution of wealth to the workers. It was the precursor of corporatism. In fact, the large industrial revolution in France took place at the time of Louis Bonaparte, a Saint-Simonist, by whom the socialists were co-opted. In contrast, Proudhon was unswervingly opposed to such state socialism. It was just like the way Marx had objected to Lassalle's state socialism. which conformed to Bismarck's state capitalism. Meanwhile, there was neither industrial capitalism nor socialist movement in the Germany of the 1830s. They existed only as ideas, to the extent that an introductory book by Lorenz von Stein, Socialism and Communism in France Today, had a large influence. Left Hegelians were, in a word, little more than a movement of those philosophers who were impacted by French socialism and communism. The movement appeared most importantly and crucially as a critique of Hegel. Hegelian philosophy was a dominant state ideology, and furthermore, Hegel himself was well informed about classical economics and even criticized it philosophically in his system, with the stance that the state qua reason would transcend the contradiction and disruption caused by the civil society as the system of wants. All left Hegelians, headed by Feuerbach, assumed the critical stance against Hegel. Feuerbach called himself a communist, seeking to practice the German philosophical interpretation of French communism. However, other young philosophers, motivated by him, began to extend the Feuerbachian critique to the socio-political sphere. For instance, Marx criticized Hegel's philosophy of right by applying the Feuerbachian critique of Christianity. Feuerbach asserted that man, a sensual being, had alienated its own specious being in the phantasm of God and should retrieve it. Likewise, Marx considered that human beings are species-essential beings only in the political state qua communal fantasy, while in civil society, they actually pursue their own interests, resulting in inequality and repression. He considered this gap as self-alienation. But, to abandon such a fantasy and realize the communal being in reality, we would have to change the civil society and abandon the capitalist economy. What should be stressed here is the fact that Marx did not agree with the idea of abolishing the capitalist economy by way of the state. It derived from Hegel's position which then, in later times, grounded state capitalism as well as state socialism. Meanwhile, Marx's goal was to abolish the political state itself, and for this purpose precisely, it was necessary to recompose the civil society taken over by the capitalist economy into a social state. This was basically the same as the anarchist idea, which Marx never left behind. Around this time, however, Marx did not have any concrete or practical scope toward the realization. His thinking was still revolving around the concept of specious being, and did not necessarily exceed Feuerbach philosophically. It is not surprising that, for Max Stirner, Marx up to this point appeared to be a follower of Feuerbach. Furthermore, Marx was at the time an admirer of Proudhon. Without considering this context, we would not understand why Stirner criticized not only Feuerbach but also Proudhon. Stirner claimed that what Feuerbach called man was a version in disguise of God or spirit, where this myself was fatally missing. He made a similar remark on Proudhon. So Feuerbach instructs us that, if one only inverts speculative philosophy, always makes the predicate the subject, and so makes the subject the object, and principle, one has the undraped truth, pure and clean. With this, to be sure, we lost the narrow religious standpoint, lost the God, who from this standpoint is subject, but we take in exchange for it the other side of religious standpoint, the moral standpoint. Thus we no longer say God is love, but love is divine. Furthermore, piety has for a century received so many blows, and had to hear its superhuman essence reviled as an inhuman one so often, that one cannot feel Marx tempted to draw the sword against it again, and yet it has almost always been only moral opponents that have appeared in the arena, to assail the supreme essence in favor of another supreme essence. So Proudhon, unabashed, says, man is destined to live without religion, but the moral law is eternal and absolute. Who would dare today to attack morality? 51. Stirner maintains that in Proudhon the state is negated, but only to be replaced by society, the general, where this I is disregarded, while the I, qua a member of the society only, is acknowledged. He termed this I as my own, which sounds like my property, a setback. However, it should be noted that this was strictly uttered as his response to Proudhon's what is property. In fact, it has nothing to do with property. Freedom is and remains a longing, a romantic plaint, a Christian hope for unearthliness and futurity. Ownness is a reality, which of itself removes just so much unfreedom as by barring your own way hinders you. The own man is the freeborn, the man free to begin with. The free man, on the contrary, is only the eleuther-romantic, the dreamer and enthusiast. 52. That is to say that to Stirner freedom is not something to be owned. Elsewhere he calls it nothingness. What he calls uniqueness signifies a mere singularity, the fact that each one is oneself in one's own way, and not a particular talent as such. Stirner claims he is an egoist. At the same time, he insists that so-called egoists are not egoists sensu stricto, because they are possessed by their desires and interests. That is to say, they are not their own. Therefore, it is not contradictory for him to seek the association, while maintaining egoism. He would rather say that only egoists can form associations and that associations should be as such. Stirner sensed the smell of the church and community in Proudhon's association, and he denied the morals imposed by the church, community or state. With this critical bias, he proposed the new ethics. He argues that, so far, individuals have been acknowledged only as members of the same family, the same ethnic group, the same nation, the same human species. That is, individuals have been acknowledged only via the higher being, but never simply as themselves. Only for the sake of a higher essence has anyone been honored from of old. Only as a ghost has he been regarded in the light of a hallowed, a protected and recognized person. If I cherish you because I hold you dear, because in you my heart finds nourishment, my need satisfaction, then it is not done for the sake of a higher essence whose hallowed body you are, not on account of my beholding in you a ghost, an appearing spirit, but from egoistic pleasure. You yourself with your essence are valuable to me, for your essence is not a higher one, is not higher and more general than you, is unique like you yourself, because it is you. Stirner came up with the kind of ethics that treats other individuals who are actually in front of us as free humans, without the mediation by any higher being such as family, community, ethnicity, state, or society. This ethics leads to the egoist's association, his socialism. Otherwise, socialism would result in the predominance of the society over individuals. Thus Stirner criticized Proudhon's association as the community that subordinates individuals. Nevertheless, Proudhon was different from the kind of communism that Stirner criticized. He denied the association in this sense. It should be said that his socialism was rather an egoist's association, as is clear in his later work, The Principle of Federation. The social contract par excellence is a federal contract, which define as follows: a bilateral and commutative contract concerning one or more specific objects, having as its necessary condition that the contracting parties retain more sovereignty and a greater scope of action than they give up. 56 Yet, at that point of time in the 1840s, it had not yet been clear to him. Meanwhile, the significance that Stirner's critique of Feuerbach had in Germany was more philosophical. Indeed, young Hegelians reversed Hegel's idealism, but they never doubted Hegelian thinking that saw the individual as a member of a category of higher being. Rejecting the substantiation of the general notion, they yet posited it as being internalized within the individual. In this manner, the higher being remained. In contrast, Stirner regarded the individual as real, and the general notion as a specter. This sounds pretty much like the nominalist assertion that only the individual is the substance, while the general is a mere notion, but it is different. In fact, he refuted not only realism but also nominalism. How, then, is his stance different from that of nominalism? In this respect, Stirner's My Own is suggestive. For instance, nominalists saw the individuality of the individual in the proper name, namely, property. Nonetheless, the proper Marx name exceeds the logic of individual genus. The problematization of the proper name goes beyond individuality generality, and unequivocally touches the dimension of singularity universality. All in all, it was not only that Stirner posited the individual as the only substance, but furthermore, that he refused to think of the individual in terms of individual genus. Therefore, when he grasped the ego as singularity, it could result in the association of egoists. You bring into a union your whole power, your competence, and power. In a society you are employed, with your working power. In the former you live egoistically, in the latter humanly, that is, religiously, as a member in the body of this Lord. 58. It is well known that Marx mockingly criticized Stirner in the German ideology, but the book was not published contemporaneously. Stirner was rapidly forgotten, not due to Marx's criticism, but because of the revolution in 1848. When Stirner was re-evaluated in the late 19th century, Marx's criticism of Stirner also drew attention. However, since it was read within the scheme of Marxist anarchist opposition, the relationship between the two was not sufficiently considered. It is apparent that Stirner's critique of Feuerbach played a decisive role in Marx's getting out of the enclosure of Hegelian discourse. In fact, it brought Marx what Althusser called the epistemological break. Marx wrote in 1845 after Ego and Its Own came out, Feuerbach resolves the essence of religion into the essence of man. But the essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality it is the ensemble of the social relations. 59. This man is what Stirner called a spectre. Marx wrote with Engels as if responding to Stirner. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity and the material conditions of their life, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. 60. Now Marx starts with individuals, located in the social relations. We are located in multiple relations such as gender, family, class, ethnicity, and nationality, which often contradict each other. For example, I am a parent to my child, and a child to my parent. I am a teacher and a student. I employ others and am employed by others, and so on. The essence of me, namely, what I am, is defined only by the ensemble of those relations, while the imaginary notion such as man qua essence effaces those relations. Yet, at the same time, I am an existence that is different from the essence determined by those social relations. My existence is, after all, nothing, in the sense that it owns no positive contents. However, it is this nothingness, owning nothing, that enables us to dissent the given relatedness. That was what Stirner called my ownness. Should I still oppose Marx to Stirner? 62. If I do, I too fall into the problematic of Marxism versus existentialism. I should do otherwise, that is, see something that passed from Stirner to Marx. What counts here is to see that just as Stirner took up the absoluteness of this I by bracketing all the relations, Marx took up the absoluteness of the relations that cannot be effaced by one's will or one's idea, particularly the idea of man. Marx persisted in this recognition in Capital, that is, his thoroughgoing natural historical viewpoint that sees individuals as located in the terms of relational structures. Marx criticized Stirner in the German ideology and Proudhon in the poverty of philosophy. But this chronological order tends to overlook the fact that both Stirner and Marx learned from and targeted Proudhon. Like other young Hegelians, Marx had been approaching and criticizing British economics by way of Proudhon's socialism. When Marx wrote The Poverty of Philosophy, Proudhon was rather negative toward the idea of political revolution wherein the working class seizes power, and he contended that the expansion of a free associative exchange system, say, producers' cooperatives and exchange banks without interest, would replace the state and capitalist economy. Marx argued that so long as classes and class opposition last, it is impossible to reduce politics to economy. The liberation of the working class should be made through political revolution. However, one cannot understand the whole of Proudhon and Marx's relation from considerations of this period alone. Before long their positions came, in a way, to be reversed. In 1848, Proudhon participated in the political revolution. In the meantime, after 1848, Marx began to find hope in the non-capitalist cooperative production in Britain, where workers' political movements, the Marx Chartist movement et al., reached their peak in 1848 and turned apolitical. One should not distinguish these two directions as political revolution and social revolution, as has been done. I propose reconsidering and redefining them as the struggle remaining within the capitalist economy and the struggle that seeks to extend the capitalist economy. They are both indispensable to the abolition of the capitalist economy, and we have to see how they can relate to each other. For this purpose, it is necessary to elucidate the capitalist economy theoretically. It is clear that Proudhon did not have this problematic consciousness, but neither did Marx at that point. Marx was not negative of Proudhon's associationism, but he recognized that it could only be a partial and complementary movement under the strain of capital and state. Proudhon took the capitalist economy too lightly. Following the labor theory of value, English classical economics grasped money only as a means of designating labor value. In a similar way, Proudhon took money lightly and had the naive objective of abolishing money and creating an organization of mutual exchange with the spirit of give and take by establishing a currency without interest. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx began to appreciate the bourgeois economist Ricardo, of whom he had been negative under the influence of Proudhon. The book expresses Marx's appreciation of Ricardo's project of analyzing the system of the capitalist economy by the labor theory of value. Ricardo shows us the real movement of bourgeois production, which constitutes value. Proudhon, leaving this real movement out of account, fumes and frets in order to invent new processes and to achieve the reorganization of the world on a would-be new formula. which formula is no more than the theoretical expression of the real movement which exists and which is so well described by Ricardo. Ricardo takes present-day society as his starting point to demonstrate to us how it constitutes value. Proudhon takes constituted value as his starting point to constitute a new social world with the aid of this value. The determination of value by labor time is, for Ricardo, the law of exchange value. For Proudhon, it is the synthesis of use value and exchange value. Ricardo's theory of values is the scientific interpretation of actual economic like. Proudhon's theory of values is the utopian interpretation of Ricardo's theory. Ricardo establishes the truth of his formula by deriving it from all economic relations and by explaining in this way all phenomena, even those like rent, accumulation of capital and the relation of wages to profits, which at first sight seem to contradict it. Marx is not necessarily upgrading Ricardo by degrading Proudhon. It just occurred to him that, in order to overcome the capitalist economy, it was necessary to grasp it as a system first. In this sense, the poverty of philosophy initiates Marx's path to capital. To Marx, Proudhon was blind to the dynamic force of capitalism that incessantly transforms social relations, because he took for granted the free individuals as such who were themselves products of the capitalist market economy. For instance, Proudhon's concepts of the masses or people do not involve socio-economic relations. After having been exiled to Belgium in 1858, Proudhon published The Principle of Federation in order to criticize the former socialists who were falling into nationalism and centralism. Although this work pointed out the antinomy between authority and liberty, it failed to understand why people supported the Emperor Bonaparte. Proudhon saw it as the nature of people themselves. The organization of liberal or democratic government is more complicated and more sophisticated, its practice more laborious and less dramatic than that of monarchical government. Consequently, it is less popular. Almost always the masses have regarded forms of free government as aristocratic, and they have preferred absolute monarchy. Hence that vicious circle in which progressives are trapped, and which will trap them still for many years to come. Naturally, it is in order to improve the lot of the masses that Republicans demand liberties and securities. It is, therefore, upon the people that they must rely. But it is always the people who, through their distrust of or indifference to democratic forms, stand in the way of liberty. In this there is a recognition that Bakunin could not have had. Yet it is rather odd that, after Marx's intricate analysis of the social relations and the parliamentary system in the 18th Brumaire, Proudhon ascribed the whole issue to the nature of people. He is explaining the reason why Bonaparte became the emperor merely by the inclination of people to love authority. When Proudhon published this, Marx was writing the corpus that was later edited and published as the third volume of Capital, striving to understand why the capital and state endure so tenaciously. Nevertheless, this does Marx not mean in the least that Marx denied Proudhon's associationism. This does not mean that Proudhon's ideas of cooperative and exchange bank were obsolete. At the same time he approved these ideas, or precisely because of his approval, Marx criticized Proudhon. Marx's critique stressed the point in his instructions for delegates to the Geneva Congress. It is the business of the International Working Men's Association to combine and generalize the spontaneous movements of the working classes, but not to indicate or impose any doctrinaire system whatever. The Congress should, therefore, proclaim no special system of cooperation, but limit itself to the enunciation of a few general principles. We are acknowledged the cooperative movement as one of the transforming forces of the present society based upon class antagonism. Its great merit is to practically show that the present pauperizing and despotic system of the subordination of labor to capital can be superseded by the republican and beneficent system of the association of free and equal producers, restricted, however, to the dwarfish forms into which individual wage slaves can elaborate it by their private efforts. The cooperative system will never transform capitalistic society. To convert social production into one large and harmonious system of free and cooperative labor, general social changes are wanted, changes of the general conditions of society, never to be realized save by the transfer of the organized forces of society, viz., the state power, from capitalists and landlords to the producers themselves. We recommend to the working men to embark in cooperative production rather than in cooperative stores. The latter touch but the surface of the present economical system. The former attacks its groundwork. We recommend to all cooperative societies to convert one part of their joint income into a fund for propagating their principles by examples as well as by precept. In other words, by promoting the establishment of new cooperative fabrics. as well as by teaching and preaching, in order to prevent cooperative societies from degenerating into ordinary middle-class joint stock companies. All workmen employed, whether shareholders or not, ought to share alike. As a mere temporary expedient, we are willing to allow shareholders a low rate of interest. Marxists who have believed that the first step toward communism is the planned, state-owned economy have neglected both producers' cooperatives and consumers' cooperatives. Originally conceptualized by utopians since Robert Owen, cooperative movements gained popularity in the 1860s in England after innumerable setbacks. Not only did Marx never deny them, but he saw possible communism in the association of free and equal producers. At the same time, Marx pointed out the limit of the cooperative movements. They are constantly placed in severe competition with capital. Their options would be either to remain partially in the area of production where capitalist mode is hardly developed, to become a stock company itself, or to be defeated in the competition and go bankrupt. Therefore, to convert social production into one large and harmonious system of free and cooperative labor, general social changes are wanted, changes of the general conditions of society, never to be realized save by the transfer of the organized forces of society, namely, the state power, from capitalists and landlords to the producers themselves. Needless to say, as is clear in his critique of Lassalle, it is not to foster cooperative societies with state aid. To transfer state power to the producers does not mean that they seize it, but that they abolish it. Association of associations should take the place of the state. As I mentioned before, Bakunin thought that Lassalle's idea derived from Marx, but nothing is so alien to Marx than resorting to state power, as Lassalle did. Nonetheless, Marx was also different from Bakunin in the very aspect that Marx assumed a center for integrating the multiple associations, while refusing the center of the state power. Is authoritarianism? According to Proudhon, anarchism is not anarchic, but orderly. It is still a sort of government. While acknowledging that the phrase anarchic government involves a kind of contradiction and sounds absurd, Proudhon insists that anarchy is a form of government, that is, self-government or autonomy. Also, he defined anarchism as the idea of reducing political functions to industrial functions, and that a social order arises that forms nothing but transactions and exchanges. In this light, Marx's idea of converting social production into one large and harmonious system of free and cooperative labor is not contradictory to Proudhon's idea. It has nothing to do with state control. It is worth noting that Proudhon regarded authority and liberty as not merely contradictory but as antinomy, which means that the two opposite propositions are valid. The thesis is, there ought to be the center. The antithesis is, there ought not to be a center. For instance, anarchists defy any authority. But if this stance only brings about chaos, it would end up helping authority to reassert itself. Proudhon believed he found the principle to overcome this antinomy in the association. It resolves all the problems posed by the need to reconcile liberty and authority. Thanks to this idea, we need no longer fear being overwhelmed by the antinomies of rule. 67 It would be a new system that solves the antinomy of freedom and authority. Earlier in the same book he said, to balance two forces is to submit them to a law which, obliging each to respect the other, brings them into agreement. What will supply us with this new element, superior to both authority and liberty, and acquiring preeminence with the consent of both? The contract, whose terms establish right, and bear equally upon two contending forces. Therefore, when Marx criticized Bakunin, he did it not as an authoritarian. Rather, he took the antinomy that Proudhon pointed out much more seriously than Bakunin did. What is more, Marx praised the Paris Commune, carried out mainly by Proudhonists, in which he found the vision of possible communism. Marx was seeking a method of achieving the liberty that neither falls into chaos nor into state authority. Marx's manuscript for the third volume of Capital reads as follows: Wordgesagt, das nicht allgemein Überproduktion, sondern Disproportion innerhalb der verschiedenen Produktionszweige stattfindet. So heißt das weiter nichts als das innerhalb der kapitalistischen Produktionszweige die Proportionalität darstellt, indem hier der Zusammenhang der Produktion als Blindsgesetz auf die Produktionsagenten wirkt. Sie nicht als assozierter Verstand in ihrer gemeinsamen Kontrolle unterworfen haben. This translates to the following: if it is said that there is no general overproduction, but simply a disproportion between the different branches of production, this again means nothing more than that, within capitalist production, the proportionality of the particular branches of production presents itself as a process of passing constantly out of and into disproportionality. since here the interconnection of production as a whole functions on the agents of production as a blind law, and they do not bring the productive process under their common control as their associated understanding. As Japanese philosopher Minoru Tabata pointed out, Engels made an alteration to the passage while editing Capital. Word gesagt, das nicht Telegemein über Production, sondern Disproportion innerhalb der verschiedenen Produktionszweige stattfindet. So heißt dies weiter nichts, als das innerhalb der kapitalistischen Produktion die Proportionalität der einzelnen Produktionszweige sich als beständiger Prozess aus der Disproportionalität darstellt. Indem hier der Zusammenhang der gesamten Produktion als blindes Gesetz den Produktionsagenten sich aufzwingt. Nicht als von ihrem associierten Verstand begriffenes und damit beherrschtes Gesetz den Produktionsprozess ihrer gemeinsamen Kontrolle unterworfen hat. This is the same as the version available in English today. If it is said that there is no general overproduction, but simply a disproportion between the various branches of production, this again means nothing more than that, within capitalist production, the proportionality of the particular branches of production presents itself as a process of passing constantly out of and into disproportionality, since the interconnection of production as a whole here forces itself on the agents of production as a blind law, and not as a law which, being grasped and therefore mastered by their combined reason, brings the productive process under their common control. Engels' interpolation is almost criminal. With his insistence on the law, he shifted Marx's regulative idea to the constitutive idea of the Kantian problematic. Obviously, Engels's position is that rule by the cognition of objective law is equal to freedom. In this context, associater Verstand is no more than Hegelian reason, that is, combined reason. This inexorably leads to the faith that party-state bureaucrats reason control economic process. Therefore we can say that from Engels sprang the idea of communism qua state-centrism. In contrast, Marx never suggested that associater Verstand be established in one decisive coup. They know that the superseding of the economical conditions of the slavery of labor by the conditions of free and associated labor can only be the progressive work of time. 73. Marx. The term associater Verstand sounds rather strange. There is an issue of translation, whether it be translated as associated understanding or combined reason. The first case is understandable when compared with, for example, Habermas's attempt to reinterpret reason as public consensus by communication, but it involves more intricate and significant issues. The fact that Marx intentionally used the terms of classical German philosophy here shows that the problematic is linked to the past philosophical problems concerning sensuality and reason, or empiricism and rationalism. For instance, association in the theory of political organization could be likened to Hume's concept of association of ideas, the source of Hume's skeptical conclusion that there is no self-same, consistent, single ego. This might be the model of organization totally without a center. Counter to this account, Kant claimed that although there is no substantial ego as Descartes claimed, still existing is the transcendental apperception X that integrates the manifold associations. Kant stood critically in between Descartes and Hume. If we can apply it to the theory of political organization, state-centrism is likened to the rule by Cartesian subject, while anarchism assumes Humean association that defies all identical substance, and the function of Kantian transcendental apperception corresponds to Marx's associated understanding. In Marx's idea, association has something like the transcendental apperception X, that which should not be considered as a substantial center, like state or party. In this sense, standing in between archism and anarchism, Marx sought to transcriticize both at the same time. It is for this reason that Marx sometimes appears to be anarchist and sometimes archist. This ambiguity or even ambivalence should not be forced into a synthesis, for it is in this constant shift that Marx's Transcritique lives, and this must be something that would solve the antinomy of freedom and authority. An anarchist such as Bakunin denies all power and center. This idea takes for granted the tacit assumption that the masses liberated from oppression create an autonomous order by free association, but, as Proudhon warned, it would not happen that way. Such a process would rather invite a more muscular power. Furthermore, there is no guarantee that differences between individual abilities and the love of power would disappear in free associations. Instead, we should first assume that these would inexorably remain, and conceptualize a system where these would not found a static power and class system. Marx did not write about this, but when he highly appreciated the Paris Commune realized by the leadership of Proudhonists, he saw a step toward a possible communism. This was consistent with his earlier thinking. Early Marx began his critical intervention with the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. What he grasped therein were the separations between civil society and political state, private person and public person, that occurred in the modern state. While individuals are treated equally as public persons, they belong to the class relation of production intrinsic to the capitalist economy. Individuals as public persons can have only legislative rights or the right to vote, but they have no administrative rights whatsoever. The so-called people's sovereignty is real only in that they can vote. Look at the so-called democratic nation-states. There is no democracy whatsoever in companies and governmental offices. Marx thought that, by changing civil society, it would be possible to abolish the political state. From a more concrete viewpoint, it is by establishing a system where the social state is never alienated by the political state, where a static power system is never congealed out of the social state. What Marx discerned in Paris Commune was a concrete form of this, which he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. On the other hand, Lenin's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat resulted in the dictatorship of reason party, the dictatorship of a bureaucratic system. Consequently, today's Marxists seem to swerve away from, ignore, discard, or deny the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But if this new tendency of Marxism results in the parliamentary democracy and is satisfied by certain reformations within it, it is futile. One may not need to cling to such a misleading concept as dictatorship any longer. Yet one should not forget that historical failure contains crucial lessons. Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat is, needless to say, the conceptual opposite of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which signifies the parliamentary democracy. Historically speaking, the parliamentary democracy, Marx, that came into existence by overthrowing the absolutist monarchy, is the quintessential form of bourgeois dictatorship. So it is that a Marxian proletariat dictatorship would not assume anything similar to the form of rules extant before the bourgeois dictatorship. Feudal dictatorship or absolutist dictatorship. The bourgeois state invented devices by means of which to prevent the recurrence of dictatorship, the separation of legal, administrative, and judicial powers and the secret ballot. The separation, however, is only nominal. It is just the principle advocated in order to make sense of the duality of civil society and political state. In contrast, the dictatorship of the proletariat is, far from the dictatorship of anything, that which aims at the abolition of state power itself. Thus it should be supersensitive to the fixation of any power structure. The Paris Commune assumed both a legislative organ and an administrative organ. In this sense, it was the sublation of the duality, civil society political state, generic in the modern state. But even in such a social state where the division duality of public persons and private persons was sublated, the separation of legal, administrative, and judicial powers remained. In order to support the participatory democracy persistently, it had to be sensitive to the separation of three powers. The Paris Commune had these three departments of power, that is, it also had the representative and bureaucratic systems. It had the institution to elect and ostracize judicial and administrative officers. But would this extent be sufficient to prevent all possible fixation of legal, administrative, and judicial powers, namely, bureaucratization? As Max Weber said in his Politik als Beruf, the bureaucratic system is inevitable and necessary in those societies where the division of labor is developed, and it cannot be discarded simple-mindedly. Accordingly, we have to admit that even association necessitates representative and bureaucratic systems, and that the difference of individual abilities and the will to power remains, except that we should prevent them from resulting in any fixation of the power system. There is one crucial thing we can learn from Athenian democracy in this respect. The ancient democracy was established by overthrowing tyranny and equipped itself with a meticulous device for preventing tyranny from reviving. The salient characteristic of Athenian democracy is not a direct participation of everyone in the assembly, as always claimed, but a systematic control of the administrative power. The crux was the system of lottery, to elect public servants by lottery and to surveil the deeds of public servants by means of a group of jurors who are also elected by lottery. Interestingly, Pericles, who executed political reformation implementing this idea, later fell from power by the same system. My point is that the core of the system invented to stop the fixation of power in Athenian democracy lay not in the election itself, but in the lottery. Lottery functions to introduce contingency into the magnetic power center. The point is to shake up the positions where power tends to be concentrated. Entrenchment of power in administrative positions can be avoided by a sudden attack of contingency. It is only the lottery that actualizes the separation of the three powers. If universal suffrage by secret ballot, namely, parliamentary democracy, is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the introduction of a lottery should be deemed the dictatorship of the proletariat. The association of associations or Associaterverstand inexorably entails a center, yet the center is constantly replaced by the contingency. The centrality of the center is displaced in this manner. The center exists and does not exist at the same time. That is to say, it is the concrete form of the Kantian transcendental apperception. Proudhon learned much from Athenian democracy, but he criticized the bourgeois system of universal suffrage, referring to it as just like a lottery. Notwithstanding the derogatory nuances attached to the term lottery, lottery is not in the least obstructive to the electoral system, but a sine qua non to maximize its function. In any kind of representative vote, even of a commune, the representative and the represented are split in fixation. The same group of people are always chosen, and factional strife transpires. Can we choose all representatives by lottery in all elections? That is not realistic. The system itself would be too arbitrary to gain the trust of the people. In Athens, the generals were not elected by lottery, but they were replaced every day. Thereby a fixation of power was avoided. Speaking of the use of lottery in institutions today, it is used only for posts anyone can do, but no one wants to do, such as jurors. In other words, lottery is used only in the case where the candidate's abilities are equal or do not matter. For us, the point of using it is the opposite. We would use it in order to save the elections from corruption and choose relatively talented leaders. Considering these examples, what is preferable to us would be to choose the most crucial post by lottery, namely, first choosing 3 candidates by secret vote and then finally electing one by lottery, because the last and most crucial stage is determined by contingency. Factional disputes or conflicts over successors would not make sense. As a result, a relatively superior, if not the best, representative would take up the post. Furthermore, the one who is chosen could not parade his or her superiority and power, while those who are not chosen have no reason to refuse collaboration. This kind of political technique would be functional and would go beyond the cliché, all the power will fall. Employed in such manner, the lottery would be an ideal method to free the power center from fixation in the long run and choose able managers and leaders when necessary. To repeat, we should not assume that the human nature of loving power ever changes, or that the difference and heterogeneity of individual abilities ever disappears. Even in the production systems or cooperatives managed by workers, these elements are sustained, especially when the extra-capitalist production systems have to compete with capitalist enterprises. They are forced either to adopt the organizational principle of corporations for the sake of improving production or lose and disappear. Our ideal organization should assume the existence of hierarchy from the beginning, except that it introduces the election and lottery to escape the stagnation of the power structure. Organization for any counteraction against state and capitalism must introduce within itself the device of introducing contingency in the magnetic power center. If not, it will be like the thing it intends to counter. But unfortunately, as a point of fact, various civil acts that have begun to negate power centralist hierarchical organization remain scattered and have yet to gather themselves for a collective intervention. They tend to offer the most reliable source of votes for relatively progressive parties. They are incapable of executing real counteractions to capital and state. Meanwhile, if and only if we introduce the political technique outlined earlier will we not have to fear the dangers of centralization. The crisis of synthesis. 5.1 The form of value qua synthetic judgment, ex ante facto and ex post facto. Capital is a book of political economy. So it is that the majority of Marxists tacitly swerved their attention to other writings in order to find Marx's philosophy or political ideas. In other words, they sought to interpret capital by way of the philosophy found elsewhere. I am not necessarily of the opinion that Marx's non-capital work can be ignored. Yet still I insist that Marx's philosophy as well as his idea of revolution should be found in Capital. Generally speaking, political economy is a science that cannot acknowledge the being of enigma in human exchange. It takes for granted that the economic activity is sacrilege and clear, though there may be bizarre and complex enigmas outside. In other domains, political economists rather believe that they can elucidate these enigmas by relying on the objective knowledge of the political economy. On the other hand, There is no human activity that is not an exchange. The state, nation, and even religion are forms of exchange. In this sense, it is possible to see all human activities as economic. Seen in this way, the domain of political economy is not necessarily more simple, practical, and objective than others. The world of political economy, the world organized by money or credit, is precisely like the world organized by gods and faith, totally phantasmagoric, yet powerful in its ability to bind and trample our beings. Marx. Classical economists had sought to approach the issue of commodities value from the vantage point of labor. They had seen money merely as the index of labor value. To them there was no enigma of money. Based upon the experience of observing the newly appeared industrial